The sky over the Nevada desert in the mid-1960s was not just a testing ground, it was a canvas for a new kind of warfare. In the wake of the U-2 shootdown over Sverdlovsk in 1960, a cold, hard truth had settled over the Pentagon. Altitude alone was no longer a sanctuary. The Soviet Union's surface-to-air missiles were climbing higher, their radars getting sharper. America's eye in the sky had been blackened, and a new solution had to be born not from incremental improvement, but from a radical leap into the unknown. That solution emerged from a place known more for its secrecy than its address, the Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California, under the merciless, brilliant gaze of Clarence Kelly Johnson. The challenge was framed not as an engineering problem, but as a physical ultimatum. Build an aircraft that moves so fast that by the time a radar pulse reaches it, reflects back, and is interpreted, the aircraft is already miles away, rendering the tracking data obsolete. Build an aircraft that flies so high and so hot that interceptor missiles, straining at the edge of the atmosphere, simply run out of energy trying to catch it. The answer was not a plane in any conventional sense. It was a statement of pure kinetic energy, forged in titanium and wrapped in a skin of black radar-absorbing paint. The A-12 Oxcart and its more famous sibling, the SR-37 Blackbird, were not merely built, they were willed into existence against a tide of impossibility. Titanium, the only metal that could withstand the searing 1,000-degree Fahrenheit temperatures sustained at Mach 3+, was sourced through clandestine channels from the very nation it was meant to overfly, the Soviet Union, using a network of shell companies and third-world intermediaries. The tools to work it had to be invented, as conventional drills shattered against the superalloy. The Pratt & Whitney J58 engines were marvels of thermodynamic alchemy, starting as conventional turbojets before morphing around Mach 2.4 into something closer to ramjets, with giant inlet spikes and bypass ducts managing a hurricane of supersonic air. The entire aircraft, from its chine-shaped fuselage to its inward-canted vertical stabilizers, was a study in reducing radar cross-section, a crude yet devastatingly effective form of stealth a generation before the word entered the lexicon. When the first A-12 slipped into the sky in 1962, it was a creature from another time. To stand near it on the tarmac at Area 51 was to feel its alien presence. It was long, lean, and utterly black, a shard of perpetual midnight. Its engines were vast, cyclopean sockets. Fuel dripped from its seams on the ground, a purposeful design quirk, as its titanium skin panels were designed to seal only when thermal expansion welded them tight in the furnace of high-speed flight. It looked less like a machine meant to fly, and more like an instrument of profound, silent intrusion. Its performance numbers were not just impressive, they were demoralizing for any potential adversary. Cruise speed, Mach 3.2, over 2,200 miles per hour. Cruise altitude, 85,000 feet, and could kiss 100,000. At that speed and height, it outran every manned interceptor in the world with a margin so wide it was humiliating. It flew faster than the bullets fired from a fighter's cannons. It flew higher than any surface-to-air missile could reliably reach. Its existence, known to only a handful of presidents, cabinet members, and Skunk Works engineers, was a strategic earthquake. It meant that American intelligence could, with near impunity, peer into any corner of the Soviet Empire. The delicate balance of terror, underpinned by the fear of the unseen, had just been tilted. The Soviets were now blind in their own backyard, and they didn't even know it yet. The Blackbird was more than a plane, it was a psychological weapon of the highest order, a ghost that flew on the edge of space, rewriting the rules of engagement before a single mission was flown. The first operational mission was not over the Soviet heartland. That was too great a risk. Instead, the target was a cauldron of escalating tensions where Soviet equipment and advisors were heavily involved, North Vietnam. But to reach Hanoi, the Blackbird, flown by the CIA's A-12 detachment, had to skirt the very edge of the Soviet Far East. It was here, on an overcast morning in early 1968, that the Ghost made its first fleeting appearance on the enemy's scopes. Deep inside a concrete bunker in the Seacoat Allen mountain range, a young Soviet radar operator named Dmitry was nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. His console was part of the mighty Tall King Early Warning Network, a chain of towering radars designed to detect incoming American bombers. The screen was a familiar green swirl of ground clutter and occasional slow-moving civil aviation tracks. Then, at the extreme edge of his sector, over the Sea of Japan, a tiny, hesitant blip appeared. It was faint, flickering in and out of existence, as if unsure of its own reality. Dmitry leaned forward, adjusting his gain. The target's speed, calculated by the system's clattering mechanical computer, made him blink. The number was nonsensical. It suggested a velocity beyond any known aircraft, faster than a falling missile. The heat signature, picked up by a secondary infrared sensor, was another anomaly. It was a fierce, concentrated bloom, unlike the broader signature of a bomber or even a high-flying MiG. "Station 7, this is Central. Report your track 743, a voice crackled over the intercom. Dmitry keyed his mic. "Central, track 743 is anomalous. Speed is unreliable. Signal is intermittent, possibly a false return from atmospheric ducting." He invoked the common scapegoat for radar ghosts, a layer of air that could bend signals and create mirages. There was a long pause. "Record the data and continue monitoring." The blip traversed his sector in less than 2 minutes, a journey that should have taken 10. Then, as it approached the forbidden line of the North Korean coast, it vanished, not by turning away or descending, but by simply fading. One sweep it was there, a faint prick of light. The next, the screen was clear. Dmitry filed his report, marking it as a probable system anomaly, but a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. The machine had calculated a track. It had pointed somewhere deep over Manchuria. A week later, it happened again. Same sector, same impossible speed, same ghostly fade. This time, Dmitry wasn't alone. Another station to the north caught a fragment of the same impossible thing. 2 separate systems with different operating frequencies had seen the same impossible thing. The report was no longer filed under anomaly. It was stamped with a single, red, Cyrillic word, unidentified. The fragments of data were rushed to Moscow, to the desk of analysts at the GRU and the PVO Stranye, the Amansk Air Defense Forces. They pored over the faint signals. The speed was consistent. The altitude was stratospheric. The radar return was minuscule, a fraction of what a B-52 or even a U-2 would produce. The heat signature was all wrong, too hot, too focused. The conclusion, whispered in corridors thick with cigarette smoke and paranoia, was both terrifying and unacceptable. Something was penetrating their airspace, something American, something they could not see clearly, could not track consistently, and most importantly, could not stop. The psychological impact was immediate and corrosive. For decades, Soviet defense had been built on a foundation of immense, layered territory and increasingly sophisticated integrated air defense systems. The concept of territorial inviolability was sacred. Now there was a crack in the fortress wall, and through it slipped a silent black shape moving at the speed of a rifle bullet. The intruder wasn't just violating their airspace, it was violating their entire doctrine of security. The message was clear: your homeland is an open book, and we are turning the pages at our leisure. The protocol was immediate. Search and rescue aircraft, unmarked, civilian-contracted planes already loitering discreetly along the flight path, were scrambled.
They raced to the last known coordinates, a point in the sky over the rugged, desolate landscape of the Kaibab Plateau north of the Grand Canyon. They saw nothing, no contrail, no debris field, no telltale splash of scorched earth. The air was crystalline, empty. Civilian air traffic control was quietly queried about unusual returns. They had seen nothing. The North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, was brought into the loop, their vast, continent-spanning radar fences reviewed. They had tracked the article's blistering ascent, and then they hadn't. There was no blip that slowly faded as a target descended. There was a track, and then there was an absence, as if the target had simply been erased from their scopes. On the ground, teams and unmarked trucks combed the calculated debris path. They found nothing, not a scrap of composite skin, not a shard of canopy, not a shred of wiring. It was as if the 90-ton aircraft, its pilot, its engines, its revolutionary cameras, had been translated into another dimension. The official investigation was, by necessity, a ghost itself. It produced a classified report of stunning emptiness. No cause could be determined. The leading theory, whispered in secure rooms, was a catastrophic, instantaneous structural failure, a fancy way of saying the plane blew apart. But that defied physics. At that altitude, debris would have scattered over hundreds of miles, and some of it, like the indestructible engine cores, would have been found. There was no explosion on radar, no sonic boom of breakup. The beacon's final flicker was examined until the tape wore thin. It showed no pattern of distress, only a brief, unexplained attenuation. The other theory, the one that lived in the gut of every engineer who worked on the project, was worse. A failure of the unknown. Had the radical materials, stressed beyond any conceivable test, undergone a strange, sudden disintegration? Had the aircraft, pushing into a regime of hypersonic aerodynamics that was only theoretical, encountered a phenomenon, a thermal thicket or a violent pressure oscillation that tore it to subatomic pieces? Or had it, in its quest to vanish from enemy radars, perfected its invisibility so completely that it had vanished from reality itself? The article, and majestic with it, had simply dissolved from the sky. It left behind no wreckage, no answers, only a vacuum of data and a chilling, enduring silence. The most advanced aircraft ever built had achieved its primary objective on its first and only flight. It had disappeared without a trace. But it had done so for the wrong side, taking its secrets into a blue, unknowing heaven. The project was sealed, stamped, and buried in the deepest vault of the Cold War, a monument not to triumph, but to a mystery that refused to yield. The sky, it seemed, had claimed its own. The silence in the blockhouse at Groom Lake did not last long. It was shattered by a protocol as cold and precise as the machine that was now missing. Klaxons remained silent. This was not an emergency to be broadcast, but phones on secure lines were lifted, and a sequence of code words were uttered into receivers, activating a machinery of secrecy and recovery that spanned the continent. Within minutes, the article's disappearance was no longer an accident. It was a breach of national security of the highest magnitude. The aircraft itself was the secret. Its very shape, its materials, its performance envelope, all were more classified than the nuclear football. It could not be allowed to be found, even by its own creators. The search operation that unfolded over the following weeks was a masterpiece of clandestine logistics, a phantom hunt conducted by ghosts. It operated on two parallel, desperate tracks: the physical sweep of the calculated impact corridor and the intelligence lockdown to ensure no foreign power even suspected something was lost. On the ground, the terrain below the last known coordinates was some of the most rugged and inaccessible in North America. The Kaibab Plateau, a vast high-altitude tableland of dense ponderosa pine forests, deep limestone canyons, and wind-scoured sagebrush flats, leading to the yawning geological wound of the Grand Canyon itself. Into this wilderness descended not military units in uniform, but teams of civilian geologists and forestry surveyors. They drove unmarked Jeeps and Piper Super Cubs, their vehicles outfitted with sensitive radiation detectors to sniff out the small nuclear-powered auxiliary unit for the cameras, magnetic anomaly detectors, and spectroscopic sniffers that could detect the unique chemical signature of the article's exotic jet fuel, a formulation known as PF1, a volatile fluorine-based concoction that burned with a faint, invisible blue flame. They walked grid patterns, their eyes scanning the thick pine needle duff and rocky scree for any sign of impact, a scarred tree, a disturbed patch of earth. They found nothing. No shattered trunks, no furrowed ground. Helicopters with specialized rotor blades for high-altitude work skimmed the treetops, their downdraft stirring the dust of centuries, revealing only more ancient rock. They detected no radiation, no magnetic whispers of buried titanium, no chemical tang of spilled fuel. The search expanded, following the cruel logic of physics. At the article's speed and altitude, a catastrophic breakup would have created a debris field hundreds of miles long. Search teams were dispatched along a parabola stretching from central Nevada, across Utah, into Colorado and New Mexico. They combed the salt flats, the high deserts, the peaks of the Rockies. They interviewed ranchers, hikers, and lonely truckers on Route 50, the loneliest road in America. Had they seen a flash? Heard a strange thunder, found any unusual metal? The answers were always negative, sometimes accompanied by a suspicious squint. The teams left behind only confusion and a vague cover story about meteorite tracking. Above, the eyes in the sky joined the hunt. The very technology the article was meant to pioneer was now turned upon its own disappearance. Corona and Gambit reconnaissance satellites, their details still decades from declassification, were tasked with photographing the entire search corridor. Their powerful cameras, capable of spotting a tank from 100 miles up, scanned every square mile. Analysts at the National Photographic Interpretation Center, NPIC, in Washington, D.C., pored over the grainy black-and-white prints under magnifying loupes, looking for the telltale shadow of wreckage, for a scorch mark on the landscape. They saw canyons, mesas, forests, and dry lake beds. They saw no aircraft. At sea, the Navy quietly vectored submarines and surface vessels with advanced sonar and underwater listening arrays to patrol the Pacific approaches off the California coast, on the remote chance the article had somehow continued westward for thousands of miles before ditching. They listened for the pinging of a pilot's survival beacon, for the groan of collapsing airframes on the ocean floor. They heard whales, earthquakes, and the endless rumble of the deep, nothing else. The intelligence lockdown was arguably more intense. A wall of silence order was issued. Everyone with knowledge of the article, from Kelly Johnson and his senior engineers to the cooks in the Groom Lake mess hall, were re-debriefed under intimidating circumstances. They were reminded of their lifetime secrecy oaths in language that carried the chill of treason. In foreign capitals, CIA station chiefs were tasked with a delicate, paranoid mission: to listen for a hint, for a whisper in the Soviet or Chinese intelligence apparatus that they had found something, or even knew something was lost. They monitored military frequencies, paid informants in aerospace ministries, and analyzed public statements for any cryptic gloating. The silence from the other side of the Iron Curtain was total and unnerving. It suggested either supreme ignorance or supreme discretion. This was the paradox that began to haunt the search commanders. Physics said the jet had to be somewhere. 90 tons of metal, composite, and flesh does not simply cease to exist. It obeys the laws of gravity, momentum, and conservation of mass. It must leave a crater, a debris field, a stain. Intelligence said it was nowhere. Every sensor, every human eye, every asset pointed at the problem returned a blank slate. It was as if the article, in its final moment, had transcended the very physical laws it was built to exploit. The search, after 6 exhaustive weeks, was called off not because they had given up, but because continuing risked exposing the secret they were trying to contain. The official internal finding was a single bleak sentence: asset and pilot presumed lost, cause undetermined, no recoverable materials located. It was an admission of defeat that solved nothing.
The response from Moscow was not a single order, but a tsunami of frantic activity. The Cold War's already feverish pace of military development was injected with a potent new strain of desperation. The Politburo authorized a blank check approach, unleashing a flood of rubles into a shadow war of research and development. The goal was no longer parity, it was survival in a new technological dimension. The effort was organized like a military campaign, with multiple fronts opening simultaneously. Front 1. The eyes. If existing radars couldn't see the Blackbird clearly, new ones must be built. The Soviet Union embarked on a crash program to develop radars operating in new frequency bands, particularly in the lower VHF wavelengths. The physics was crude but hopeful. The Blackbird's stealthy shape was optimized against the higher frequency S and X band radars used for fire control. A massive VHF radar, with its longer wavelength, might see the aircraft not as a precise shape, but as a larger, resonant blob that its shaping couldn't fully defeat. This led to the monstrous Steelyard and Tall King systems, gargantuan, fixed-array radars the size of apartment buildings, sprouting from remote locations. They were powerful enough to, theoretically, detect the disturbance, but they were also wildly inaccurate for targeting, environmentally catastrophic, and glaringly obvious to American satellites. They could say something was there, but not precisely where or what to shoot at. Front 2. The fists. The interceptor fleet was deemed inadequate overnight. The MiG-25, though fast, couldn't climb high enough or sustain speed long enough. The answer was the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-31 Foxhound. This was not merely an improved jet, it was a dedicated system. It carried the revolutionary Zaslon phased array radar, one of the first in the world, capable of look-down, shoot-down engagement and handling multiple targets. It was paired with the new R-33 long-range air-to-air missile, a huge, heavyweight weapon designed to be launched from below and behind, then climb on a ballistic arc to smash targets at extreme altitude. Every aspect of the MiG-31 was engineered with one primary adversary in mind: the high-flying, high-speed intruder from the West. Similarly, the Surface-to-Air Missile Corps received the S-300 system, a new generation of mobile, vertically launched SAMs, with better altitude performance and faster reaction times than the lumbering S-200s. The Front 3, the brain. Tracking and engaging a Mach 3+ target required computational power that Soviet vacuum tube and early transistor technology struggled to provide. A secret initiative, parallel to the American push for microelectronics, was accelerated. Design bureaus in Kyiv and Moscow worked around the clock to develop faster signal processors and data links that could take the faint, flickering returns from the new radars and translate them into firing solutions before the target vanished over the horizon. It was a race against time defined in milliseconds. Hundreds of scientists, engineers, and technicians disappeared into closed cities with names like Gorky and Zhukovsky. Billions of rubles, diverted from consumer goods, from infrastructure, from the already strained Soviet economy, vanished into these black projects. The human cost was immense, with careers made and broken by the ability to solve an equation or shave a kilogram from a missile's weight. Yet with each prototype test, a grim pattern emerged. The MiG-31, while formidable, could still not achieve a stable, sustained tail chase on a target at 85,000 feet and Mach 3.2. The S-300's engagement envelope, while impressive, had a slender upper margin that the Blackbird danced along. The new radars provided warning, but not the crisp, kill-quality track needed for kill. Every test,
Every simulation seemed to reveal that they were building solutions to yesterday's problem. The American ghost kept setting the pace, and the USSR, for all its resources and brilliance, was always one step behind in the most expensive and demoralizing intelligence race in history. For over 2 decades, the SR-31 Blackbird, which succeeded the CIA's A-12, was not just an intelligence asset, it was a strategic regulator, a silent maestro conducting the movements of the Soviet military from the edge of space. Its very existence and its proven invulnerability warped the entire landscape of Cold War confrontation. The routine was always the same, and its predictability was part of its power. When a crisis flared, a naval standoff in the Mediterranean, tensions along the inner German border, Soviet exercises in the Arctic, a Blackbird would be dispatched from its forward operating location at RAF Mildenhall in England or Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa. It would streak towards the Soviet periphery. Instantly, the vast, lumbering machine of Soviet air defense would convulse into action. The ghost was on the scopes. The alarm, codenamed Yastreb meaning hawk, would flash through command bunkers. Interceptor regiments from the Baltic to the Pacific would scramble their MiG-25s and later MiG-31s. SAM battalions would go to full alert, their radars sweeping, missile crews strapped into their chairs. Command posts were flooded with confused, contradictory data. The Blackbird's flight path dictated Soviet deployments. If it feinted towards the Kola Peninsula, resources were pulled from the Black Sea. If it probed the Kuril Islands, the Far Eastern Military District went on a hair-trigger alert. The psychological toll on Soviet commanders and operators was immense. They knew, in their hearts, that they could not touch it. The scramble was a ritual, a performative act of defiance that underscored their impotence. Pilots would return from these futile chases dejected, their aircraft drained of fuel, having seen nothing but empty sky and the contrails of their own wingmen. The aircraft's performance parameters became the rigid benchmarks for every new Soviet system. Specifications for the MiG-31 were not abstract goals, they were direct answers. Must be able to reach 80,000 feet. Must be able to sustain Mach 2.8 for X minutes. Must be able to engage a target with a radar cross-section of Y. The Blackbird's shadow loomed over every design bureau meeting, every state acceptance trial. It forced technological leaps, yes, but leaps that were reactive, draining, and always chasing a moving target. The Soviet military-industrial complex was forced into a narrow, exhausting corridor of development, all its creative and financial energy funneled into countering a single platform. At the highest levels of policy, the Blackbird's invincibility shaped Soviet strategic thinking. It made the concept of a surprise nuclear first strike even more terrifyingly feasible for Soviet planners. If the Americans could fly with impunity over their early warning radars and missile fields, what else could they do? It fed a paranoia that made arms control negotiations more difficult and fueled the desire for ever larger arsenals as a form of compensation for defensive weakness. The USSR wasn't rewriting its defenses out of a desire for innovation. It was doing so out of a profound institutionalized fear. A fear born from the weekly, monthly, yearly reminder that a single black unarmed aircraft could hold the world's largest country hostage to its cameras. The chessboard was theirs, but the Americans had introduced a piece that moved by its own rules. The admission did not come in a public speech or a fiery protest at the United Nations. It was inscribed in the dry, technical language of a classified assessment, buried in the archives of the Soviet General Staff. Declassified after the fall of the USSR, the document is a masterpiece of bleak professional honesty. Dated 1979, entitled Assessment of Capabilities Against the Lockheed SR-71 Strategic Reconnaissance Aircraft, it lays out in chilling detail the scope of the failure. The report runs through each system: the improved radars,
the MiG-31, the S-300, the computerized command networks. It acknowledges incremental improvements in detection range and warning time. But its central conclusion is a damning, unvarnished truth, stated in a single, devastating sentence. Po imeushim się ocenkam perichwat da nowa samolotów chemi imeushim się w nastoящее время sredствами невозможен. According to available assessments, interception of this aircraft by any means currently available is impossible. The words impossible resonate with a finality that must have been galling to write. This was the official internal surrender. The report went on to outline the new doctrine it necessitated. No longer would the PVO Strony operate on the premise of destroying the intruder over Soviet territory. The goal was now a desperate three-tiered approach. First, detect it earlier using the network of massive early warning radars and signals intelligence from listening posts. Second, track it continuously by fusing data from every sensor across the entire country, a concept pushing the limits of their data link technology. Third, and most aspirational, defeated through future systems, and by attempting to engage it at its most vulnerable moments, during takeoff or landing from its overseas bases, or with standoff weapons launched from extreme range, hoping for a lucky hit. But the final unspoken truth of the document and of the entire two-decade struggle is contained in the operational records that have also since emerged. In thousands of sorties, from the Arctic Circle to the Sea of Japan, the SR-71 Blackbird overflew or probed Soviet airspace 3,551 documented times. It was fired upon by missiles on numerous occasions. It was chased by the best interceptors the USSR could build. Not once was it hit. Not once was it even seriously threatened. The aircraft that shouldn't have existed had not only forced a superpower to rewrite its defense strategy, it had exposed the limits of that superpower's science, its industry, and its will. It flew as a permanent negation of their power, a sleek black argument in titanium that they could never answer. When the SR-71 was finally retired in 1990, it was not because the Soviets had caught up, it was because satellites had finally matured. The Ghost was rendered obsolete by its own side, leaving behind a legacy of awe and a lesson written across the skies, that speed, audacity, and a relentless pursuit of the impossible could for a time hold an empire at bay.